once we get around the bend, there was like a fucking mountain goat in our lane. And I somehow swerved around it between that and the truck and got back over and didn't crash. And then like literally we pulled over. There was a rest stop like a mile up, and we just pulled over and all just kind of sat in like silence and looked at each other. And we're like, man. And then I remember that when we got to Vancouver, Miles like literally stopped me when we got to the car, was like, hey, thanks for not killing us last night. And like like it was, man.
Glad I saw it there versus 30 minutes in, but
yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks for everyone tuning in. This is another episode of the Scoped Exposure podcast. I'm sitting down with Jessee Mr. Kowalski. Thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, how's it going?
And for the few people who are watching or listening who might not know who you are, can you just give a little intro on how you be best known in Western Canadian hardcore?
I'm Jessee. For some reason, people like to refer to me by my last name for some fucking reason, Kowalski. I play in a band called Meantime. I run a small record label, Demolition Records. I've been in a million other bands over the last 15 years, and book shows sometimes too in Winnipeg.
Yeah, and there's a ton of things there that we're going to probably cover, some of the different bands that you played in, the record label for sure, and some details about Meantime and what's happening with that project. But before we get super deep into it, I always love to get a little bit of context about where people grew up, how they got into heavier music or hardcore overall. So can you talk to me about the early Kowalski days, when you were just a wee lad and just kind of getting into hardcore in general?
How much time do you have?
Well, usually these podcasts are about an hour, but we might have to do these in phases, it sounds like.
Right. Yeah, it's trying to think of how I could best word it, but it's kind of strange how it all just ended up working out. I grew up in Dauphin, Manitoba, which is, sure you're aware, but most people aren't aware unless they were into metalcore 15 years ago. But it's a small town in the middle of nowhere in Manitoba, basically by Saskatchewan, and it's kind of between Regina and Winnipeg if you go more north. But there is nothing out there for people into stuff that we're into. So it's kind of a weird place to grow up, but luckily enough, when I was a kid, there was a huge punk and hardcore scene there for some unknown fucking reason. But before that, before I even really knew what any of that was, my dad had been into punk in the 70s and early 80s.
Okay.
For some weird reason, which again makes no sense to me, because if you talk to my dad now, it just would blow your mind. But so when I was a kid, he always had those records around, and then he ended up giving them to me later on. So I have a pretty cool collection of early 80s, late 70s punk records, which is pretty sick. But he had some pretty bad problems going on, not to get into it too much, but he got saved or whatever you want to call it and became a born again Christian. And for whatever reason at that point in the early 2000s, Christian punk and hardcore was a really big thing everywhere.
Yeah.
So there was this band called Means, who originally at that point were called Means to an End. They were from Dauphin. They all went to school there. There was a Christian school, a high school there, and they would book shows there. And then for whatever reason, after my dad got born again, whatever you want to call it, I guess he just found out there was these shows, and he thought it'd be a cool thing to bring me to. And this is 2001, 2002. So I was 11, I was a little kid.
Right.
So he started bringing me to those, and then eventually he just kind of stopped going. I just started going by myself as a little kid, and with my cousin Simon, who plays bass in Meantime. And that was kind of the start of that. It's just really bizarre to think about being a little kid just riding my bike or my skateboard to these shows, and all these, people who are significantly older. Like, just thinking about it now, I'd be like weirded out by a little kid being around, but it's kind of sick.
Yeah. And there's a couple of things there as far as like the accessibility, like Dauphin, like if you look at a map, it's literally in the middle of nowhere. So like, was your dad like driving you into town, so to speak, to go to certain shows in like Brandon or
No,
Prairie or anything like that?
no, that's the weird part too, is like, so my dad has never driven in his life.
Oh, okay.
Never had a car. He walks everywhere. It's like, to this day, walks or rides his bike. Like, he's a weird guy.
Wow.
But so, like him picking me up to a show, he'd walk over to my mom's and we'd walk to the show, which is, if anyone's ever been to a show there, was usually at the old fire hall, which is like, was our CBGBs basically.
Sure. Yeah.
But after like, a couple of years of that, like by like, I would say, I kind of went to a few shows, but I wasn't really like, I didn't really know it was like hardcore or punk or whatever. Like, I just called it punk. And the Dauphin thing was just, everyone said going to shows, like, hey, are you going to the show this weekend? It was really kind of just, that's what it was. But like around 2005 or so, that was when, some of the older kids like started taking me and Simon with them to shows out of town. And like Neepawa had a really good scene, which is crazy to think about because it's even smaller than Dauphin.
Yeah.
And one of my favorite bands to this day was from there, Anew, they were called. And then, Brandon was 2 hours south. Russell was right around there. They had like shows. So, everyone kind of went to each other's shows, and they were all, an hour or two apart. And it was a fun time.
Yeah. And that's also a generational thing as far as like back, at least when I was first getting into hardcore and shows in general, like, Winkler and Riverton and like all these tiny little Manitoba towns could have like a 100+ person show and people going off, and great bands from all those areas as well. It's definitely, that is not the common thing, at least nowadays.
No, not at all. It's mind blowing. Like, I was talking to a few people the other day about like the fact that, like, I don't know what it is lately. I've just been on a big Holly Springs Disaster kick, because that was like one of my favorite bands back then.
Yeah.
Excuse me. And we were just talking about how hard they toured and how insane it was that they could do a 3-month Canadian tour and spend 6 weeks in Western Canada.
Right. Yeah.
Whereas now you can barely get 5 shows if you're lucky.
Right.
And the drives are brutal too.
Yeah. Yeah, nowadays it's like going from Winnipeg to Regina and then to Calgary, Edmonton, maybe Kelowna, and then Vancouver, and and if there's certain towns in between that are like, hey, we have shows or we want shows as well, like, please let it be known, because I'm sure any Canadian band would love to play to people and not have to drive at least eight hours on average to get to the next city.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So started in Dauphin, and then eventually, when did you eventually move into living in Winnipeg?
Like years later. Like, I don't think I moved here till 2014, but I had been, coming here like every weekend before that, playing in bands here and stuff for a long time. But
sure.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time in Dauphin, like even after shit, like stuff was pretty much dead there. But yeah, it was probably too long, I'd say.
Yeah. Yeah, but you mentioned Means as like a band that was kind of based there, and like for me, like that was, I think, like my first ever hardcore show was their last show. It was like the church basement. So
crazy. Like they to this day is still one of my all-time favorite bands, like, and even more so like when they were still Means to an End, which was like their first kind of incarnation of the band before they got like hardcore. It was kind of more, they
were like a 3-piece.
Yeah. And like, if you don't have that stuff, I should send it to you. It's still some of my like favorite stuff to listen to this day. And just like thinking about those shows back then, that's like such a special time and place. Just, the best. Take me back.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think, like it's always, it's always important to know those formative bands and years, because like it encourages me that like, even like, it feels silly to say, but like projects that I'm a part of or projects that you're a part of, like those, little things can influence a whole generation of new hardcore kids, hopefully.
Well, yeah, and just like getting to know those guys a bit, like their old bassist Blair, we still talk frequently, and the drummer Aaron too. Is like just watching how they operated as a band and as like a little kid, and just being able to ask them questions about like, how do you get shirts made? How do you do this? Like,
Right.
Just seeing how they did things was, that's how we learned how to, do stuff. And it was like when they all moved away to Regina, and the one guy who did shows in Dauphin, Jess Bombing, who's like Drake's photographer now in Toronto, and
What
just
the fuck? That's crazy.
Yeah, man. Like, if you ever seen pictures of Mean's last tour, like almost all their promo pictures over the years, he took them. But they moved to Regina, he moved to Toronto, and those were the guys we learned everything from. So when they moved away, it was like, I guess we have to start doing shows now. And that's literally like how I fell into playing in bands and how I started putting on shows. It was just everyone moved away. And like within the span of a year, everyone moved away. Like 2006, everyone was gone. Yeah. And then it was like, who's going to do a show? And The Fortunate was coming through, I think. And then I was just like, I'll do it. And I was like, 14 or something. I didn't even know anything about like anything like that. You need a float, that you need like to, rent a PA.
To run doors and
yeah, exactly. So I had, I didn't know, like I'd been going to these shows and I had barely been in a band for a couple months. And same thing with the band I joined. It was Jordan from The Fortunate played bass, and then he quit to do that band. And then they were like, well, we need a bass player for the show. It was with Far From Ruin, who were like one of my favorite bands to this day too, like underrated Regina band. They were so good at that point, but they had the show booked with them. And, I just happened to be at their practice because it was kids I grew up with and they lived down the street from me. And I was like, I'll play bass. Mm-hmm. They're like, do you know how? And I was like, I had a guitar for like 2 or 3 months. It was like summer vacation and I had gotten a guitar and I was taking a couple lessons. And then it was like, yeah, I'll play bass. And then they were like, okay, I guess you're in the band. So and thank God it was like metalcore, because then you could just play the open note.
Yeah, just the top string.
Yeah, that's all I knew for like 2 years. And then I remember by our last show, our singer's dad, which was actually Ben, who ended up playing in Time's Tide, weirdly enough, his dad was like, I actually saw you hitting notes today. And I was like, yeah.
Right. Yeah, I do. I forget that guy grew up in Dauphin originally. Yeah.
One of my oldest bandmates. For sure.
Yeah. So The Fortunate was the very first band that you ever played in?
No, I booked a show for them. I was in this band called The Emendation.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Like, just imagine like 2005, 2006, like Haste the Day, throwdown kind of stuff, right. Just mosh metal.
Yeah. Yeah, sick. Cool. So you grew up in Dauphin, started to get more involved in booking shows and things like that. What, maybe we're fast forwarding a little bit here, but as far as like being in Winnipeg and starting to be more a part of that scene versus Dauphin or that kind of area, what were some of the bands that you had wanted to start and then kind of transition to, at least the years that me and you kind of started to know each other?
It's funny because like I guess Meantime would be the band I always wanted to start. Like if you even look back to like when we did Goonies back in the day, like it was so bad, but like if you listen to I listened to some of it the other day and it is god awful, but it's like the blueprints there for the band I always wanted to do. Sure. I was super into like the Northwest stuff happening at the time, like Go It Alone, Blue Monday, stuff like that. And then older stuff like Bold and Youth of Today. Just that's always been my favorite stuff in hardcore. But that's a band I always wanted to do. But unfortunately, I spent 10 years not doing that. Yeah. Pardon me, doing other stuff. Like I was in Penalty for a while, which was fun. But, I just played bass and that wasn't my thing at all. And then, I was in Elder Abuse for a bit, which again, like, not really my heart wasn't really in that stuff. That was just, I wanted to be in a band.
Yeah.
And so,
essentially it was like lots of homies that kind of had like part-time
exactly.
positions, so to speak, and jumping on there.
Exactly. Yeah. It was just because I wanted to be in bands. So I'd play stuff that I, didn't really necessarily love. Like Elder Beast was, kind of pop, it's pop punk. And I like some of that stuff, but like, if you know me, that's not my bag.
Yeah. There's always a couple bands that I've played in as well where it's like, this is my project and I'm fully invested. And there's others where it's like, yeah, like I get to play some certain kinds of riffs, whether they're heavy or lighter or whatever, and getting to scratch that itch. But when it
Ill-fated was sorry, what were you saying?
No, I was just saying like you get to scratch that itch without, but then over time, if it becomes like a serious thing, then you're like, oh shit, like, am I in or out of this?
Yeah. Well, that was when Jazz Dave started trying to get Ill-fated going again with a new lineup. Like me and him had not been friends like at all, like did not like each other stemming back many years. And then one day he just messaged me out of the blue and buried it and was like, you're straight edge, I'm straight edge. I'm restarting my straight edge band, playing it. And like Adam from Withdrawal played bass, and he's like my best friend. And Simon, my other best friend, who's, been in Meantime and stuff, he came along and played drums. So that was like the first band since like Goonies basically that I was like full tilt into it, like all about it, loved it.
Yeah, and that was right around the time that I started going to like straight up hardcore shows in Winnipeg, and so getting to see you guys and playing with you, but also like, I think the very first show that I filmed for Scoped was Ill-fated was on the bill. And
yeah, it was when we covered Danzig, I think, and made Adam sing it.
Yeah, I do remember that. Did you also intro with a Metallica song as well?
Yeah, we covered Enter Sandman. It was funny because that was like back when everyone was kind of doing like the Biohazard. Everyone kept covering Punishment at like every show you went to. You could hear like the intro to Punishment. So we played like a couple notes of that, and then everyone started like moshing like insane. And then we were like, fuck that. We went right into Enter Sandman, and then people went even crazier. And it was the dumbest thing ever, but it was fun.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite song that you've ever covered with any of your bands before?
That Enter Sandman thing was too funny, and like that was actually sick. Another one was when Penalty played, I think, the first Southern Alberta Hardcore Fest, and I think we were Ill-fated played pretty high up on Saturday, which was sick, and we had like a insane stupid reaction, which I did not expect. But Penalty opened the Friday, and we were like, man, no one's gonna watch us, no one's gonna care, we better like do something dumb because we're in Calgary. So we covered Bother to Try by Act Fast, which was like, weirdly enough, like from that era, like 2006 2007, they were like the shit on MySpace. Like everyone, like, like I was 12 hours away from Calgary, but we loved them. And like, so we covered that, and everyone went crazy, and that kind of set the tone for it. So that was another favorite. And then with Meantime, we would always do I think like we would always do covers of stuff I really liked and I'm influenced by. Like we covered Burning Fight by Inside Out on one tour, and I just think covers are the best because like that's how I learned about a lot of stuff when I was younger. And even still, so you hear something, you're like, oh man, that's sick, what is that? And then
yeah, I totally agree, because like I think that first fest which was in 2016, like I was still kind of learning some of the maybe more historical Western Canada hardcore bands. So when you guys covered that, I was like, okay, I know this isn't a Penalty song, but like everyone here in Calgary is going off. And then like eventually found out, okay, this is Act Fast, and then discovered kind of like their legacy through people here. And then like it was a band that I never thought that I would ever get to see. And then the fact that they did that reunion set was insane.
Oh man, that's like I don't mosh at all anymore, but I was in there for that. And then I'm sure in the videos you can see me just out of breath, going side to side, being fat. But
yeah, well, at least it's not Adam Dyson breaking his arm to the Meantime set from that year.
And that was another cover. We covered Strife.
Oh, that's true. Yeah,
because it has quite possibly the dumbest breakdown of all time in it, and it's great. And yeah, he broke his arm on some nerd's head.
Yeah.
So
I guess like since we're on this subject, do you like, I know there's like an unwritten rule potentially of like only covering like older bands or bands that are broken up, bands that wouldn't, come around to like play that actual song to that audience. But I'm curious on your thoughts on that, or what goes into picking a good hardcore cover.
Oh man. For me, I always think it's just like, what's like the dumbest, funnest thing that's like gonna make people go off. Like, meantime, we covered Twist of Cain by Danzig once, but meantime did a straight up Green Day cover show. Like, we entered a bands as bands and we played as Mean Day, and we did a 100% faithful like Green Day cover set where like I was wearing like the red tie and had like mascara on and played guitar too. Whoa. And like, yeah, I'll send you some videos later, but like,
was this after I moved, or
yeah,
like,
this is like
so under the radar that you didn't
yeah, like, they just have those like rock and roulette things at the Handsome Daughter or whatever.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, we just played one of those because we thought it was funny, and like, it was like, no, like, it's all these like weird, like they straight up were a Blink-182 cover band. That was their whole shtick.
Yeah.
And we just entered it, and then we ended up like blowing them off the stage, and the guy running it was like, this is the best one we've ever had. Yeah. And I think that's the show that convinced Steve to join the band, because he was there. And yeah, it was, I don't know. Sorry, that's a little off topic, but
no, that's fine.
For picking a cover, it's just, yeah, what's gonna be like fun and dumb. Like, I don't know. There's like there's nothing worse too than when like such a great song gets covered and then it's like a flat reaction. Like, a lot of people used to cover Where It Went by Judge, and it's such a great song, but it's kind of long and drags on, and it always is just like a bummer to see live, and it's like, fuck. Yeah. So I don't know. It's just, you got to pick something kind of short and sweet and fun and dumb, and hopefully enough people know it.
Yeah. Do you think it's the right thing to cover it exactly as it was written, or throw like even just a little bit of a spin on it, or is that kind of dependent on the song, I guess?
Depends on the song. I think that's kind of cool too. Like, I mean, there was that awful trend in like the early 2000s, like Punk Goes Whatever, and there'd be like, metalcore covers of fucking like bullshit. And like Newfound Glory was like the guiltiest of it. Man, they put out like 5 fucking records of them covering like songs. And I mean, it's kind of funny, but it's like, I don't know. I think it's cool.
The horse was beaten quite to death. Yeah.
I think it's cool when you do like faithful, but if you want to put like a little spin on it, that's cool too.
Sure. Cool. So, you were mentioning your band Meantime, and that was a project that like you said, like it was musically, it was the one that you wanted to write for a really long time, and just took a while to like, okay, like I'm going to are you the one to kind of like write everything and then kind of hand that off to everyone else, or is it like a collaborative effort between a couple guys?
That's pretty much what it was, is like I would write the songs and arrange it, like, and sometimes even record like really crappy demos where I play drums too, and then like teach the rest of the band, whoever was in it at that point, the songs. And like there's some stuff where like I'm like, I don't know, I'm kind of hard to be in a band with, I guess, which we can talk about later, but I'm trying to not be as it was always kind of like my way or the highway. But like there have been times where people have been like, oh, let's try this, and I'm like, oh, I don't know, and then they do it and it is sick and I'm proven wrong. Right. So then I've got to like eat my words. But for the most part, it's just like, here it is, learn it, let's go. And that's the way it is. Yeah. Which, blessing and a curse sometimes, because I don't think we put out anything bad, but there's always room for compromise.
Yeah.
Which I've learned.
Yeah, I think if I was on it, like if I wasn't in a band where I've had that kind of similar experience where someone's like hey, me and so-and-so are the writers, and then everyone else is like essentially playing the riffs. And like for me, that was Extract, because it was Hof and Brad just like busting out these like hard ass songs, and I was like, I don't want to touch the the recipe. I just want to, you know, be a part of it. So
Yeah.
you know, on being on the outside, it's like, oh, can I, you know, sit in on a practice? But like, if there's something that's like worked out, whether it's just one mind or maybe two, I think it actually makes things more efficient than like, you know, oh, like we're not being inclusive. So, so in the sense of meantime, like that was a band that you started, I guess, what years? Like 2018, I guess, and then
late 2016, early 2017,
oh,
me
okay.
and Miles started jamming, and we recorded, a couple like demo tracks, and then we just sat on it for a while because I'm like, you know, I work away.
Yeah.
Excuse me again. Yeah, like I work away. So we kind of like late 2016, we started jamming, and then we both got busy and we're like, whatever. And then that spring around this time, I get laid off every spring for 2 months ish. Usually this year, I think I'm fucked for a while, but yeah. Yeah. So then I was like, fuck, like I hit him up and I was like, man, let's actually do it. And he's like, okay. So then we jammed really hard for a couple weeks, recorded the first demo, and then we played the first or I don't know what the fuck, like the fest has had like in Calgary's had like 5 names. Yeah. So
I think the first time you guys played was the first year I was filming as like Scope. So that was the Western Front 2017.
Yeah. And that was our first show.
Yeah.
And I mean, wasn't the best show. And that was like, you know, we hadn't really jammed much as a band because it was just me and Miles always, right? Like
sure.
And on the recordings too, it was just me and Miles, everything always just me and Miles. And then everyone else would, you know, we'd learn, like we had Jazz Dave for a while playing bass and guitar and Hofer. And, you know, like we hadn't had much time to jam with them. And
yeah, it's pretty interesting to like watch the different meantime sets that I have on the channel. It's like, oh, this is the one with Simon on bass. This is the one with Steve on guitar, Dylan on bass. So I think the nickname has been like Jessee and the Kowalskis, or, you know, the Jessee Kowalski experience, as far as, you know, having the backbone always be like you and Miles as far as the vocals and drums, but then kind of swapping out members just because of, you know, flexibility and whatnot.
Well, I think once Jessee, like, because Jazz Dave quit when we were on tour. We were in Vancouver. This is like late 2017. He quit like at the show and just whatever. There's been all kinds of shit with him since then that we don't really need to make public on here, but whatever, you know. Anyway, he's out of the picture. So he quit, and then it was like Simon had already joined, and then, you know, Hofer, love him, but, you know, his heart really isn't in that style anymore. He's busy with his own Viva Non stuff, so it was kind of like a mutual thing where he was gonna, you know, go do his own thing, which is the right choice. I mean, he's doing great. So we had Simon, then I was like, fuck, well, I'd been in Penalty with other Jessee, like Weimer, and but we weren't really like friends per se. Like we were, but we weren't like, you know, we weren't close. And I was like, fuck it, like let's jam with this guy. So me and Miles went and jammed with him, and then we were just like, yeah, you're hired. And then we went on tour like a couple weeks later. Like he learned the set right away, and then it was just like that was it. And we went and played the DPK 4-year like 3 weeks later. We went and did like and you filmed the Calgary, so that was a great show.
Yeah, that was like the most packed I've ever seen Commons, and just like people going off for you guys. That's probably, you know, there's few single cam sets that'll go back and sit through, but that one I've watched my fair share amount of times.
Yeah, it's still one of my favorite shows we've played to this day. Like it was because we were still pretty new, and I mean, like I don't know, I'm like such a pessimist that I think this is the worst attitude ever, but I think I'm always expecting everything to go so horribly wrong that it's nice when I'm proven, you know, like the other way. But I always think everything's going to suck, and I suck, and I'm just so anxious and have such bad stage fright that I just like, before we start playing, I'm always like, fuck, this is going to be bad. And then it's not, and then it's always good. So
yeah, there's a weird balance of like, you know, balancing that anxiety and maybe not like judging yourself too much, but at the same time, like hardcore by nature is a very chaotic genre. So like it's far more likely that things are going to, strings break, guitars get unplugged, mics get knocked out of people's hands. So it might be a little good to have a little bit of like being on edge as far as like, knowing when things are about to break, for sure.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah. So as far as the band, there's been a little bit of a lull of, not really much going on. But, this podcast is one that you wanted to kind of share some news of what is maybe the next chapter for Meantime. And hopefully that's enough lead up to kind of hand it off to you to kind of share what you want to share.
Well, first I should probably just kind of clear the air about like what has kind of happened. Like I said, I'm not the easiest guy to be in a band with. And, kind of long story short, like I was definitely not nice to some of those guys. Particularly like Miles and Jessee, like we would fight a lot and I would just, any little thing I would just take out on them, which is not right, so I've kind of had to like deal with that. And, I was like going through a pretty rough time personally at that time, like lots of mental health stuff that I just was refusing to deal with and telling people I was dealing with, but I kind of wasn't wholeheartedly making an actual attempt, you're just kind of going through the motions of like, oh yeah, I'm going to counseling, but am I really doing the work that I need to do to like actually be better, Mm-hmm. So that's obviously a lot to deal with without getting into it too much. But, so that kind of like when we went and played Calgary, that kind of, I was such a prick to those guys and it kind of just blew up on the way home and then whatever shit since then. So, I mean, we're all friends again now and it's good. But, I've had to like really be accountable for a lot of the dumb shit I've done over the years and the way I've treated people and just own up to it and try and be not an asshole. So
yeah, and I think it's it's very mature of you to like be addressing that not only on the podcast but just like out loud. So and I think like a lot of people don't realize like being in a band with people is like kind of like joining a family in a way. And there's things from I guess like the difference between a family is like you grow up together, but like when you join into a band, it's like you have people from all walks of different life. You have people in all different stages in their life whether they're in a relationship, they're married, going through something, what have you. So I think when I started to and like you said, we don't have to get into the details because I don't think that's productive, but I think once I started to hear about some of those things, I knew that it just needed time for things to turn a leaf, and you guys kind of and obviously if anyone knows you guys are talking and you're friends again and whatnot, and that time is over. As far as stuff that's upcoming, what was maybe the thing for you to think about, like, okay, I still want to do something under the name Meantime versus making another whole band and kind of starting from scratch in a way?
Well, first of all, to go back to, it was like when I first kind of started trying to like go to like therapy and meetings and stuff, it was like, I in my head I kind of thought like, like not even consciously, but I was just thinking like, I got to do this just to save band stuff because I put so much time and effort into like being a band and getting to like, not that we're like some big band or whatever, but just getting to where I wanted to be, accomplishing goals, and like to go back even further, like I've always just had like such a chip on my shoulder about like, I grew up in the middle of nowhere. We got shit on by everyone in Winnipeg when we were kids. And like, what that era of Winnipeg was not nice, like to younger people. I'm sure you remember like the horror stories. So, I've always just wanted to like, I was in bands that like sucked or whatever. And it's just like, I always wanted to like, that's just me. I was like, I can't like half-ass anything. And I always just want to be the best and do like the best and do what I accomplish goals I want. And then, so like, I was like, fuck, I need to like do this just to save the work I've put in, the money, etc. And then it's like, that's like the worst reason for bettering yourself whatsoever. So I did that for a couple months, and I like really wasn't, feeling any better. And then it was like one day it just clicked. It's like, fuck that. If it happens, it happens. I need to like really focus on my energy into just like being a better, I don't know, not a better person, but just like actually trying this shit. And if I get to play music again later, like that's a bonus, but I really need to like, like address the issue and traumas and stuff that I've, been bottling up forever.
Yeah.
Otherwise I'm not going to be able to live, because that was like another thing that had been going on is, like, a couple suicide attempts in there over the years that like, I've never really talked about that shit, but like now I'm just like, that's like, I wear that shit. It's like, yeah, I did this stuff, and it's not cool, but it's like, that's part of who I am. It's brought me to where I am now, to be able to like talk about that stuff. So once I realized that like nothing matters if you're not doing it for the right reasons, then I had to kind of reset around Christmas. Around then I just had this big epiphany. I was home for Christmas. I had some weird family shit happen. Like my family's a trip. So then I was just really contemplating everything, and then it just clicked for me. And since then it's been better. And it's like, yeah, I want to do this band again with, there's definitely lineup changes, but yeah, that's where I am now.
Yeah. And kind of like that, the mentality of having like one foot in the door and one foot out is kind of like spinning your tires at the end of the day. Like you're not really making that true, like those true leaps forward that you want to, like, mental health stuff of any magnitude shouldn't have a timestamp of like how long you want it to take. It should just be like, okay, I'm just going to be open and I'm going to try and figure and just let things, heal as, things do. So, stoked to hear that you're kind of on the right path. And, yeah.
Good.
Yeah. So yeah, around Christmas, you're like, meantime 2.0, if you want to call it that. Is there anything that is, obviously it's tough to kind of plan things, like I think we were talking about this before we were recording, but some things are mixed up with quarantine and coronavirus, but do you want to tease any like roadmaps or eventually what you want to have accomplished, and what the focus of the band is going to be essentially?
Like I know I'll never be able to fully commit to like touring a lot and shit, just because the nature of my job and the fact that we're all older now, and it is what it is. But it's like it sucks too, like you said, coronavirus really fucked shit up, because the album was actually supposed to be like pretty much almost being done, recorded by now. I was hoping to be putting the finishing touches on it by now, and getting it mixed and mastered in May, and then hopefully getting it pressed by the end of so that in the fall I had big plans for some US and Canadian shows that I've had to like put on hold, and then and then in between then getting the the new lineup together to jam and stuff. So this kind of really fucked it all up, but hey, whatever. Like you said, you can't really just put a time frame on stuff. That's kind of something I've learned too, is just let it go, and when it happens, it'll happen. I'm not too worried about it. And like that was one of my problems before, is I'm just so like, okay, we have this plan, we have to do this exactly XYZ, otherwise my head will explode. So
yeah, and there's a weird balance of like being OCD with that, with your like just being okay with not having full control of something, I think is kind of the theme. Yeah. It's
scary, but something I've like really kind of learned to embrace, because ask anyone I've been in a band with, like I'm a control freak. Like, even to the point where like I get not mad, but I get freaked out when other people drive the van. Like I need to drive all the time. Like it's bad.
Yeah. Well, like the van that you were driving for the meantime stuff was yours, so I guess that makes sense to a degree. But yeah, I've never heard of being like, no, like I am the only one who can drive this vehicle.
You remember the band First Blood?
Yeah.
Yeah, their singer Carl is like that. And I remember when I heard about that, I was like, wow, this weird. Like, I'll let other people drive. I just prefer to do the driving because, like years and years ago, probably like 12 years ago, 11 years ago, it was 2009. Me and Simon's old band Good Things was like doing a little tour, and it was like March or something. We flipped our van really bad and yeah, totaled it. All our gear was on the highway. It was a total fucking disaster. And I remember actually we were supposed to be playing a show with Waster, and we ended up getting like a ride to the show and just seeing all those guys. And yeah, it was pretty crazy.
Yeah.
But so ever since then, I've just like driving really, I can't like, I have trouble being like comfortable in a vehicle if I'm not driving.
Yeah.
So that's kind of part of it. But I don't know. Yeah, I also just like being like, I don't know. I like being in control too, I guess. But I'll let other people drive. But that Carl dude, like, I've straight up heard stories like when he's tired, like the van stops and the band stops and they don't go anywhere until he feels like driving again. Like if he wants to stop and look at the Grand Canyon, that's what the band's doing. So
we're pulling over, boys. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty funny. Like that makes total sense to me because like one of the first jobs I had getting into video was working at a trucking industry, and I worked in the marketing department. So they had a very, I guess, empowering statement of like, if you're tired, like you can pull over, we'll adjust the plans or whatever it is.
I wish
a lot of a lot of people trying to be heroes and stay up the longest when they're just like, having micro sleeps or whatever it is. Scary stuff.
Yeah, that was like when we went to the DPK 4 year. There was so much driving in like a couple days, like, and I did the bulk of it. But like, we took my car because I didn't have the van yet, and we just borrowed like gear everywhere. And like, fuck, man, like the drive from Calgary to Vancouver overnight in the mountains, and there was a blizzard.
In wintertime, it was February. Yeah.
It was an avalanche. We got stuck behind for a while, and then when they let us go, like it was fucked, man. We were in my Taurus with like, we joke that I had racing slicks on it because like tires. It was just my town car. Like I had a truck for work.
Yeah.
And so I didn't at that point I was like, fuck it, I don't need winter tires. But these things were beat, and we were driving through the mountains going through all that fucked up shit. And I remember the scariest part, like it was straight up white knuckle driving all night. Like we were all awake.
Yeah, I've had one of those. Yeah.
And I just remember we came around this corner, and this semi behind us decided to like pass us right at that point. So this guy passes us or whatever, and we're like kind of coming around a corner, and then there's a semi coming the other way. And then once we get around the bend, there was like a fucking mountain goat in our lane. And I somehow swerved around it between that and the truck and got back over and didn't crash. And then like literally we pulled over. There was a rest stop like a mile up, and we just pulled over and all just kind of sat in like silence and looked at each other. And we're like, man. And then I remember that when we got to Vancouver, Miles like literally stopped me when we got to the car, was like, hey, thanks for not killing us last night. And like like it was, man.
Yeah, I remember vividly because I wanted to film the 4 year, and like an idiot, I'm like, oh, I'll just drive with the Meantime guys. And I think we were talking, and then just like with the weather, and I was looking, I was like, no, actually, I wasn't supposed to drive down with you. I was supposed to drive down with Contention from Edmonton.
Oh yeah.
But then they canceled because they couldn't get down to Calgary. And then Taylor was like, well, can you jump in with Meantime? I was like, well, if this band can't do it, like, I don't know, I don't feel like super down. And I'm like, I miss the fact that I couldn't go to more shows at 333 or film that fest, but probably wasn't meant to be. At least for me. Yeah.
I don't know. Like, that's just me though. Like, that's kind of like how I am. Like, I'm a fucking country boy, like that.
Right.
Fuck it. I don't care. We'll go. Like, I've worked on the rigs for a long time. I've seen some fucking gnarly shit where I'm just like, fuck it. Let's go. Let's just keep going. We'll make it somehow. Fuck it.
Right.
We'll figure it out. And then like, looking back though, some of the shit we've done where it's just like, what the fuck was I even thinking? Like, I don't know if do that again. But
How many
when,
bullets did I actually dodge? Like,
yeah, when I'm in the mood, like, when I get motivated for something, there's like nothing that's going to fucking stop me.
right.
So
Yeah, that's fair. One thing, as far as things that you're involved in that you're motivated about is your label, Demolition Records. Can you tell me just a little like origin about why you wanted to start that? Was it more in a way just you wanted a label to put your own bands on or support friends' bands? What was the why behind that?
like I'd always done, our own tapes or whatever, like every band I've been in, and it's weird. I've been in most of my bands with Simon,
Mm-hmm.
just kind of crazy. Cause like we're, we grew up together. He's my cousin, like we're family. He's my, like my best friend pretty much. But since like we were kids, like 2004, 2005, we started going to shows together, been in our first bunch of bands together, like everything we would do, releases together. We kind of just, we're always very like DIY oriented, that like to this day too. So I always just loved the actual, like sitting down and like putting the tapes together, putting, folding record sleeves, all that shit. Like, that was like some of my favorite. I just find it weirdly relaxing. And so that was part of it. Like I literally always have just done my own stuff out of necessity and like never really worried about, you know, other, getting on a label or anything. And so I just like the act of it. But also at the time too, I was just like, there's so much good bands, and not just specifically in Western Canada, but that's where I've done most of the stuff, and in the States a bit too. But it's like there's so many good bands that like there's people I'm friends with. There's so many of these good bands that no one's talking about, and that was kind of my motivation because like I don't know, I'm kind of opinionated about like hardcore, and I think there's a lot of bands right now that get love and they're fucking, not to be too crude, but like they're total bullshit. Like it's just fucking paint by numbers hardcore, and it just drives me up the fucking wall to see people like sucking their dicks on the internet. And so I'm like, well fuck, there's this band who doesn't do anything, doesn't add anything, give back to hardcore, and they're getting fucking their nuts washed by a bunch of kids on the internet. Meanwhile, there's this other band who are all like down ass dudes who I've known and are sick and putting out better music. It's like I would, that's what I'm going to put my time into and make sure people hear this. And that's like every release I've done is usually someone who's a good friend who's done, a new band or whatever, or just, something I've wanted to do. And it was partly to do my own stuff too, because we were doing all those meantime tapes at that point. And then I was like, fuck it. Why don't I just, I'm good at doing this. I should just do this for other bands. Mm-hmm. That was like, the first band I was supposed to do, which ended up not coming out for like a year, which is so weird, was when the Dudes in Power broke up. Like those are some of my like best friends in hardcore, like the Bremerton guys. Shout out to the Zoo. Yeah. They started Cheap Smokes, and it's basically just Power with a different name. Sure. And yeah, so and I think Pete from Ill Intent plays drums too. So it's kind of like a sick band of like all those dudes. And I was like, fuck, I want to put out their tape. And then it ended up coming out like a year later, but that was the first band that I planned on doing. And then, just like stuff like Enemies, who, again, those, like I've known Braden for 15 years because he's a Manitoba. Yeah. I used to book his very first band, the West Memphis Tragedy, back in like 2006. They sounded like Norma Jean. They used to cover Norma Jean. Yeah. Good times. But yeah, so that was basically it. Just putting out stuff that I loved and that was like, that I thought should be heard. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that there's, there's definitely some crossovers as far as like, I guess the difference with Scoped is like, there's been plenty of bands that I've either gone to a show and I just have the principle of like, I'm just going to film all the bands because, it's kind of like I've been on the receiving end where there's a band where I'm playing a show and then there's a photographer and I'm like, oh, like, did you get photos of our set? And they're like, oh no, I'm just here for so and so. And it's like,
Dude, I fucking hate that shit. If you're there, like, do the damn thing.
yeah. So anyways, I think there's been plenty of bands that I've filmed that I'm like, well, like, I'm gonna put that out, but I'm probably never gonna watch it again, or it's just kind of a weird, band, maybe not even in hardcore at all. But I think overall I've kind of tried to build this platform where I can just show authentically like what's happening, and if it's like one hardcore band on a 4-band bill of a bunch of weirdos, then it's like whatever. And half the time, like, all those bands that I film, like 99% of the time they're like, whoa, someone filmed us, this is so sick, and then they share it. And even if I get a couple like people who are interested in what we're doing, like, that's a win for me. But there's like other things that we're doing, whether through the podcast or the playlists or other things, to highlight those bands that you're seeing the work being put in, seeing these aren't just dudes who are trying to make it or anything. Like, they're genuine people that have interests and strengths and weaknesses and built a relationship with. So I totally get the idea of like seeing the lack of support in some cases, because I think there's I agree, there are a ton of bands, not even just in Western Canada, but just like all around the world, where they are on the hype train and put very little, I guess, output as far as things are concerned.
Oh, that drives me insane. Like, I don't want to sound all boomery and shit, but it's like, I really do miss like the MySpace days, even, where there was barely any, like, it's like, I was talking to a good friend of mine from back then the other day, and we watched that Holly Springs live stream the other night, and then we were all just talking about it. And it was like a bunch of kids in Western Canada created an entire economy with barely any social media or whatever skills, like, straight up MSN Messenger and MySpace. And we were able to coordinate these big tours for like, real bands that did shit. And like, it's crazy to think some of the bands that I was able to bring through Dauphin just because of MySpace. So it was like social media we thought was going to be this huge fucking cool thing, and then now it's like, I don't know, do kids even need to go to a show? Like, they can just get everything on their phone instantly, like hear everything instantly. I miss that shit of like, 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 you have waiting up till some band puts their new song on MySpace or some shit. Like, you can't listen to it on your phone. You have to be there ready to actually, you have to log on and do it, or pre-ordering records, and you wouldn't even have heard the record before it came out. Yeah, it's a gamble. But
yeah, it is like I can definitely see, like, I definitely think that the internet has expanded a lot of things, but at the same time, like, there's just so many options just in general in life to like not go to shows, sit on your ass and play video games, or be a sucker and be like, oh, I'm not going to go. Like, I've been the sucker to be like, I'm not going to go to this fest. And then I see the videos. I'm like, fuck, I should have gone to this fest. So it's a weird juggling act as far as like, being involved. But I do agree that there was maybe what some could consider a golden era, as far as like, that was the thing that people did in small towns. And, like again, like we were saying earlier, like, I remember seeing photos from like Winkler shows, and it would just be a 200-person room, and it's just like, this is Winkler, Manitoba, and now no shows of any kind happen there.
Funny to think about that, because it's like, I mean, there's two things that come to my mind. One, I think that was just like the perfect storm of like, that was the culmination of like the 90s skate punk thing. And then there was like the emo, whatever you want to call it, scene that was big at that time. But it was just like, all those bands were like, like mainstream popular. Like, there was like punk band, hardcore bands on MTV and stuff, like on Much in Canada. Like, I remember when Means and The Fortunate and Holly Springs got their videos on Much Loud in like the span of a year, which was just mind blowing. Cause it's like The Fortunate, it's like dudes I grew up with, Yeah. Like Jordan, the singer, lived down the street from me. We went to the same elementary school and shit. It's like, just, like that was a thing that could happen. Like people watched those shows, those bands were like still kind of mainstream popular, especially in Canada. Cause you think of like Alexis on Fire, what they did, even though that's a band I've never liked really, like I kind of missed the boat on them. It just never clicked with me for whatever reason. Mm-hmm. And, but they're basically responsible for like small towns having that shit go on. But at the same time, it also like, it was such a weird, cool time of like, like you said, 100 kids at a like I remember the one show, it was Holly Springs Disaster, Sydney, and 10 Second Epic in Dauphin. It was Holly Springs' first tour. It was like a week after school ended for the summer. It was so sick. And there was like 120 people at the old fire hall in Dauphin for that show. And a week before that, Means had played there with Roses Dead, had over 100 people. And a month before that, Means had played there again and drawn over 100 people. And that was like with regularity. And then kind of when I started taking over shows later that year, things like I booked a couple really good shows like that too. And then when that just like stopped, I was like, oh no, like what happened? Why is there 10 people at this show? Like what the fuck happened? But it was just, that wasn't a mainstream thing anymore, that just like normal ass kids would listen to any of those bands. So it was like a really rude awakening. Like I thought, hardcore was just going to be this big, cool, all inclusive thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It is strange. Like to even just think about how think about where you are in your life and then just being like the norm nowadays is not going to shows, like period. Like it's very much like, what do kids in high school like actually want to do, like generally speaking. And like it's not like I want to play in bands or I want to go on tour, I want to go to shows or festivals. It's like I want to be a YouTuber, I want to do things like that. And I guess there's like ebbs and flows with everything, but at least when I moved to Calgary here, like I was encouraged to see a lot more younger kids going to shows, because I think that was like a little missed at least when I was going to shows in Winnipeg.
That's no good thing here. It's fucked.
Yeah. So, I commend anyone under the age of 18 who's watching or listening to this. Shout out to you. You're keeping things moving, and new generations are always coming, and that's a great thing to be a part of.
Like I have some shows kind of planned for hopefully after this dies down, but both are at all ages spots, so I'm really hoping to make that a thing again. Like the last show I booked was last summer for Gasm and Stepping Stone, and that was all ages, and that was like, again, like 100 people were at that show, and it was in like a shitty neighborhood.
Yeah. What venue is that?
The old Neon Factory. It's on Main, kind of in the starting to get into the part of Maine where you don't want to go, but not quite there yet.
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah, I saw some photos from that. I'm like, this venue looks cool, but I was encouraged, because it's always a gamble sometimes with some Winnipeg stuff as far as like taking on tours and booking shows, but I'm stoked to hear that you're doing some stuff on the all ages front. And hopefully that happens sooner than later with this whole quarantine. But we're kind of at the time where we can start to wrap things up. The thing I like to bookend all these podcasts with is kind of like a favorite mosh or favorite show story from your years in the hardcore scene. And again, that doesn't need to be necessarily I punched X dude in the face and caused this accident. It could just be anything that you saw that just is off the top of your head.
Like, there's so much, like, this isn't even that crazy, but I remember like the first like big show I went to, it was in Neepawa in like 2005, and it was at some weird church because like I guess Steven from Anu's parents were like worked there or something, and then so they let them have this show there, and there was easily like maybe 300 people there. And I remember walking in, and it wasn't even Anu, it was, they had like this side project band called Ranger, which was like straight up like 2005 like terror worship, like camo shorts, Cuban hat, fucking hardcore.
Right.
And I just remember like that, like they were playing and everyone was just like killing each other, and I'm like a small child with like, you know, like a fucking blind skateboard sweater on, like just like a total goof. And just seeing that and I'm being like, holy fuck, like, and just me and Simon just like running in there. And we were like still used to like push moshing and shit and just getting like the shit beat out of us. But it was like life changing. It was the best. Yeah. It was a fun time. There's other moshing stories. Simon sent me a picture of it the other night. Actually, it was Ill Intent and Frustration played this show in Brandon for no reason on like a tour. So a bunch of people came from Winnipeg, and that was kind of sick. But it was like all like the, you know, all the weirdos from Brandon were there, and my old bands used to play there frequently. Like we had lots of friends there. It was only an hour and a half south of us. So we'd go there lots, but Brandon's never really had like a good scene per se. It's just lots of like weirdos who fit together and they'll just be in a hardcore band. You know, it's the classic example of like the metal dude you're friends with plays bass even though he doesn't really like punk or whatever, just to be in. So we would always play shows there, and we played a show one time with this band called Arctic Circle. Okay. And I like, you know, I used to be such an asshole. Like when I was a kid, I would like lip off fucking like adults all the time and like fuck around at shows. Like we were terrible kids. Like everyone from Dauphin, the worst behaved fucking little shits ever. Like I can't believe the stuff we got away with. But I remember like telling the guy like after they played, I was like, Arctic Circle, more like Arctic Suckle, which is like the worst joke ever. But he was like some grown man, and he got like mad and was like messaging me on my MySpace, I think at the time, and shit, and being like, man, I'll fucking kill you and all this stuff. So then I go to this Ill Intent show, and that guy's there, and he fucking says he's like an old dude with a mullet, and I think his name was like Howie or some shit, and he tried to like fight me, and I was like, you know, maybe 17 or 18. And he's like, whatever, fuck you. And we're like lipping each other off, like ready to go. And then it gets broken up. And then apparently his buddy is the security guard at this venue. So then whatever. And I found out later, everyone calls this guy Hatchet Head. And he's like some former skinhead, like a straight up Nazi skinhead who someone tried to kill once by hitting him in the head with a hatchet. And it like straight up got stuck in his head, and he beat the guys up after they like hit him. So he had this huge like zipper scar.
That's straight out of a TV show.
Dude, it's fucked. Like Brandon's a fucking weird place. Anyway, so then Ill Intent plays and they covered Biohazard, and I staged like we're all being idiots. I stage dive off the bar, and there's actually a picture of it. I'll show you after. It's pretty funny. But like minutes after that, Hatchet Head straight up tackles me, puts me in a fucking chokehold, and like slams me out the door, like with my head, basically like opening the door. And the show fucking like comes to a halt. Like Ill Intent stops playing. Everyone runs outside. I remember Floppy Matt, the singer, like getting in between us, and he's just like, yo, like stop. And then basically said they weren't going to play unless they let me back in. Wow. So then they let me back in, and then the show happened, and then everyone went fucking like absolutely haywire. Like there was like people stage diving off the bar, like going fucking bananas, like breaking shit all out. Man, like some of those shows back then I wish there was videos of, because it's like it's unbelievable. But yeah, that's a pretty wild story. The day I almost got killed by Hatchet Head.
Shout out to Hatchet Head if you're listening to this from prison.
Fuck that guy.
Yeah, fuck that guy. Well, that's a great story to end the pod. Jessee, thanks again for chatting with me. Any social handles or things you want to plug before we end things here? How can people keep up with what you're doing?
Before I go into that, shout out to the big mans. What's up, all my fellow big men?
Yes.
You can follow me on Instagram. It's Mr_cool_ice420, which I am assured is the dumbest Instagram name ever, and I'm proud of that.
Yep. And
then you can just follow Demolition Records on Instagram, or Meantime at Meantime204. And that page has kind of been dead for a bit, but I'm, once things kind of get in motion, I'm going to start using that again. And once we're ready to put this new record out and get shit happening, I'll be on there more.
Yeah, and I'm excited, and I'm sure some other people watching or listening are excited as well to hear that Meantime is coming back. And like the podcast I posted today with Taylor, like when we were talking about like favorite sets from the 5-year, he's like, oh, for sure, Meantime. That
was a fun one.
Yeah, there's a plethora of great stuff, and I'm glad to hear that it's, on making a return, and maybe in the healthiest way possible. So I'm stoked to hear that as well. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks, man. Thanks for having me.